Fog curled around the gravestones like ghostly fingers, thick enough to swallow the glow of the blood moon overhead. The cemetery, old and forgotten, sat at the edge of Black Hollow, a town where people smiled with their mouths but not their eyes. Claire Summers clutched the voice recorder in her pocket, her breath shallow. She had waited years for this moment, planned it, dreamed of it, feared it. The man walking toward her, his polished shoes clicking against the cracked path, didn't know yet that his perfect life was about to unravel. Leonard Kane was a pillar of the community, donor to charities, owner of half the town's businesses, the kind of man people described as generous without ever questioning why. Claire knew better. She had spent months digging through lies, bribes, and buried police reports. Her mother's death, ruled an accident 20 years ago, had never sat right with her. She was ready to rip the truth into the open. "You're late," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Leonard smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I didn't realize we had an appointment," he replied, smooth as always. Claire didn't blink. "Cut the act. I know what you did." She pulled out the recorder, pressing play. A crackling voice filled the silence, a witness, long silenced, describing a needle, a struggle, a cover-up. Leonard's smile froze. For a heartbeat he looked, almost human, afraid. Then his face hardened. "You shouldn't have come here, Claire." She didn't see the knife until it was too late. Behind the twisted oak trees, Mason Reed held his breath. He had been squatting in the cemetery for weeks, sleeping in the old caretaker's shed, surviving on stolen snacks and rainwater. His fingers tightened around his cracked phone, the camera still rolling as Leonard wiped the blade on his coat and walked away. Then, shaking, he crept forward. The recorder had fallen from Claire's hand, still blinking. He picked it up, along with a folded note sticking out of her pocket. The first line made his stomach drop. "If you're reading this, I'm dead." Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. Mason ran. Mason's heart pounded like a drum in his chest as he sprinted through the maze of gravestones, the fog swallowing him whole. The cold air burned his lungs. But he didn't dare stop not until he reached the broken fence at the far edge of the cemetery, where the trees grew thick and the streetlights didn't reach. He crouched behind a moss-covered statue, clutching Claire's recorder and the crumpled note like they were the only things keeping him alive. Maybe they were. His mind raced. Leonard Kane wasn't just some random killer. He was the kind of man who owned cops, judges, maybe even the mayor. If Mason went to the police, he'd be dead before sunrise. But if he did nothing, Claire's murder would disappear just like her mother's had, buried under lies and money. The recorder felt heavy in his hands. He pressed play, his breath hitching as Claire's voice, steady and fierce, filled the silence. "Leonard Kane didn't just kill my mother. He's been covering up disappearances for years. Women, runaways, anyone who got in his way. Police won't help. They're paid to look the other way." Mason's stomach twisted. He knew about the missing people. Black Hollow had whispers of them, stories told in hushed tones at bus stops and dive bars. Girls who vanished after working at Leonard's clubs, men who asked too many questions about his real estate deals. None of them ever came back. Claire's note mentioned a storage locker unit, 117, at the edge of town, stuffed with files, photos, even a ledger of bribes. It was her insurance. "If anything happens to me, take this to the press. Not here. They're all bought." Mason's hands shook. He was nobody, a 17-year-old runaway with no family, no money, and a backpack full of stolen granola bars. But he had seen Leonard's face when he killed Claire. The cold precision of it. The way he'd looked around after, like he knew someone was watching. Mason didn't sleep that night. Every rustle of leaves, every distant car engine sent his pulse skyrocketing. By dawn, he had a plan, sort of. The storage facility was a risk. Leonard might have it watched, but Claire had left one more clue. A name. Detective Harper, disgraced. Cop who'd tried to take Leonard down years ago and lost everything for it. If anyone would believe him, it was her. The problem? Harper hadn't been seen in months. Some said she drank herself to death. Others whispered she was hiding, waiting for the right moment to strike back. Mason just hoped she was still alive. Because if Leonard found out a homeless kid had evidence that could destroy him, Mason wouldn't last a week. The storage facility loomed ahead. A rusted skeleton of metal units and flickering lights, the kind of place where people stored things they wanted to forget. Mason's fingers curled around the key he'd found tucked inside Claire's notes. Mall. Cold, the numbers 117 etched into its surface. Every step he took felt too loud, his sneakers crunching over gravel like gunshots in the dead silence of the early morning. He had waited until sunrise, and the night guard dozed at his desk, and the security cameras, what few there were, glitched in the pale dawn light. Still, his skin prickled with the certainty that he was being watched. Leonard had eyes everywhere. The man owned half the town's businesses, including the private security firm that patrolled places like this. If Mason was walking into a trap, he wouldn't know until it was too late. Unit 117 was tucked in the farthest corner, its lock stiff with disuse. The key turned with a reluctant screech, and the roll-up door groaned as Mason forced it open just enough to slip inside. The air was thick with dust and the scent of old paper, and for a moment he just stood there, blinking in the dim light filtering through the cracks. Then his breath caught. The unit wasn't just full of boxes, it was a war room. Newspaper clippings covered the walls, connected by red string like spiderwebs. Photos of Leonard at charity galas, shaking hands with politicians, standing beside men with hollow eyes and sharp suits. And then, the other photos: missing persons posters, crime scene shots, autopsy reports. Claire had been building a case, piece by piece, and what she'd uncovered was bigger than Mason had ever imagined. A filing cabinet in the corner had its drawers labeled in neat, precise handwriting: real estate fraud, disappearances, the Hollow Society. The last one sent a chill down his spine. The kind of people who got away with anything, but Claire's notes made it real. Leonard wasn't just a killer, he was part of something worse. Mason's hands trembled as he flipped through the files, his stomach turning at what he found. Payoff records. Names of cops on Leonard's payroll. And then buried at the bottom of a stack, a single photograph that made his blood run cold. A young girl, maybe 15, with dark hair and a defiant stare. The caption beneath it read, "Harper's daughter. Last seen at Leonard's estate. Official report. Runaway." Mason didn't have time to process it. Outside, a car door slammed. He froze, his pulse roaring in his ears. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Someone was here. The roll-up door rattled. Mason lunged for the back of the unit, scrambling behind a tower of boxes just as the door screeched open. Light flooded in, and a shadow stretched across the concrete floor. "I know you're in here," a voice said. It wasn't Leonard, it was worse. Detective Harper stepped inside, her gun drawn. Mason held his breath, pressing himself deeper into the shadows as Harper's footsteps echoed through the storage unit, each one louder than the last. The detective moved like someone who had spent too many years chasing ghosts, her body tense, her eyes scanning every corner like she expected an ambush. The gun in her hand didn't waver, and Mason knew one wrong move would get him shot before he could even explain. He could see her face now, the deep lines of exhaustion and grief carved into her skin, the way her free hand trembled slightly before she clenched it into a fist. This wasn't the Harper from the old newspaper clippings, the bright-eyed cop who'd stood up to Leonard in court. This was someone broken, someone dangerous. And she was standing between him and the only way out. Then she spoke again, her voice low and rough, like gravel dragged over glass. "I got your message, Mason's." Stomach dropped. Message? He hadn't contacted her, hadn't even known where to find her. Claire must have. The realization hit him like a punch. This was part of the plan. Claire had set this up, left a trail for Harper to follow in case something went wrong, which meant Harper wasn't here to hurt him, probably. He forced himself to step out from behind the boxes, hands raised, Claire's files clutched tight against his chest. Harper's gun snapped up, her finger hovering over the trigger, but she didn't fire. For a long, heartbeat-stretching moment, they just stared at each other. Then her gaze flicked to the papers in his hands, to the photograph peeking out from the top. The girl, her daughter Anne, something in her face cracked. "Where did you get that?" The words came out raw, stripped bare. Mason swallowed hard. Claire Summers. She was gathering evidence. About Leonard. About everything. He hesitated, then took the risk. "She's dead. Leonard killed her. Last night, I saw it." Harper didn't move, didn't lower the gun. But her breath came faster now, her knuckles white around the grip. "Prove it." Mason fumbled for the voice recorder, his fingers slick with sweat. He hit play. Claire's voice filled the space between them, clear and unshaken, even in death. "Harper, if you're hearing this, it means Leonard finally got to me. But I've got him. Everything's here, the bribes, the cover-ups, the hollow society, and proof about your daughter. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a runaway. They took her." The gun clattered to the floor. Harper's knees buckled, and Mason realized with a cold, sinking certainty that he'd just handed her the one thing worse than grief: hope. Now they were both in danger. The air in the storage unit grew thick with the weight of unspoken truths as Harper knelt there. Her hands pressed against the cold concrete as if the ground itself might swallow her whole. Mason watched, unsure whether to reach out or run. As the detective's breathing went from ragged to eerily controlled, like she was pulling herself back from some invisible edge. When she finally looked up, her eyes were different, sharper, clearer than they'd been moments before, as if Claire's voice had snapped something inside her back into place. She reached for the fallen gun with a steadiness that surprised him, tucking it into her waistband before standing slowly. Her gaze locked onto the files in Mason's hands like they held the answers to questions that had haunted her for years. "You saw him kill her," she said. Not a question, but a statement, her voice stripped of anything resembling emotion. "In the cemetery? You were there?" Mason nodded, his throat tight, and Harper's jaw clenched so hard he could see the muscle twitch beneath her skin. "Then you know what he's capable of, and you're still here." There was something almost like respect in those words. But it was buried deep under layers of something darker. Something that made the hair on Mason's arms stand up. She moved suddenly, snatching a dusty backpack from a corner and shoving files into it with frantic precision, her hands moving faster than Mason could follow. "We have maybe 10 minutes before someone realizes I'm here," she muttered, tossing him a burner phone from her pocket. "Leonard's had people watching me for months. If they connect you to me, you're dead." Mason caught the phone, his mind razzing him. Minutes wasn't enough time to process any of this, let alone figure out what came next. But Harper was already moving toward the door, her posture coiled tight with purpose. "Wait, where are we going?" he blurted, scrambling after her. Harper didn't slow down. "Somewhere he won't expect," she said, and for the first time there was a flicker of something like fire in her voice. "Somewhere everyone in this damn town pretends doesn't exist." Mason followed her out into the pale morning light, the backpack of evidence heavy against his shoulders, his pulse hammering so loud he could barely hear the distant sound of sirens starting to wail. Harper moved like a shadow, slipping through alleys and side streets with the ease of someone who'd spent too long hiding. And Mason stuck close, his mind spinning with half-formed questions. Who was this woman, really? What had Leonard taken? From her hand, what would she do now that she had proof? The detective paused at the edge of a crumbling parking lot, her eyes scanning the street ahead before she turned to him, her voice low and urgent. "Listen carefully. Where we're going, you don't speak unless I tell you to. You don't trust anyone. And if I say run, you run like hell and don't look back." Mason nodded, his mouth dry, and Harper's expression softened, just for a second, something almost like pity flashing in her eyes. "Good, because if Leonard finds out what you're carrying, death will be the kindest thing he does to you." Then she was moving again, and Mason had no choice but to follow, the weight of Claire's files pressing into his back with every step, the ghost of her voice still ringing in his ears. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled, the sound echoing through the empty streets like a warning. The abandoned St. Mary's Orphanage stood at the edge of Black Hollow like a rotten tooth in an otherwise perfect smile peeling paint. Shattered windows and a silence so thick it felt like The building itself was holding its breath. Harper didn't hesitate as she kicked open the rusted gate, her boots crunching over broken glass as she led Mason through the overgrown courtyard, where the skeletons of old swing sets creaked in the wind like gallows. Wanted to ask why. They were here of all places, but the look on Harper's face told him questions could wait. Her entire body was coiled tight, her eyes darting to every shadow as if expecting Leonard's men to materialize from the darkness itself. The orphanage's front doors hung crooked on their hinges, and the stench of mildew and something sharper, chemicals, maybe, or old blood hit Mason like a physical force as they stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under their weight. Harper moved with purpose, shoving aside a Mathetan couch to reveal a trapdoor hidden beneath a frayed rug, its metal handle slick with condensation. "Down," she ordered, and Mason's stomach lurched as he peered into the yawning blackness below, where a set of rickety stairs disappeared into the earth. The basement was colder than the grave, the air thick with the scent of damp concrete. And gasoline? Harper flicked on a battery-powered lantern, and the sudden light revealed a space that was nothing like the decay upstairs. Neatly organized shelves of supplies, makeshift desk covered in maps and police reports, even a small cat pushed against the far wall. "This wasn't just a hideout, this was a war room," Harper said, nodding to a folding chair as she shrugged off her jacket, revealing a holstered gun and a jagged scar that ran from her collarbone to her elbow, old, but vicious enough to make Mason's throat go dry. He sat, clutching the backpack to his chest like a shield. As Harper began pacing, her boots leaving faint impressions in the dust, "Leonard owns the police, the mayor, half the damn judges in this county," she said, her voice low and rough. "But he doesn't own the past. And this place, where newspaper clippings about missing kids, dozens of them, were pinned in chaotic clusters. This is where his empire starts to crack." Mason's breath hitched as he leaned closer, his eyes catching on a familiar face in the sea of photos. Girl with freckles and a gap-toothed smile. Emily Reyes. She'd vanished from the group home last year. The cops had called it a runaway, just like Harper's daughter, just like so many others. "You think Leonard took them?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Harper's smile was all teeth. Not just him. The Hollow Society. They'd been using this town as a hunting ground for years. She yanked open a drawer, pulling out a leather-bound ledger and tossing it onto the desk with a thud that made Mason jump. That's how they keep track. Who they took, where they put them, and how much they paid to keep it quiet. Mason reached for the ledger, his fingers trembling as he flipped it open. The pages were filled with names, dates, amounts, payoffs. 2 cops, 2 social workers, even to a few reporters. But it was the last section that made his blood turn to ice. Disposals. And beside each one, single, horrifying word. Auction. Harper's hand came down on his shoulder, her grip tight enough to bruise. "Now you see," she murmured, her breath hot against his ear. "Now you know why we can't just go to the police. Why Claire died. And why, if we're going to burn Leonard's world to the ground, we're going to need more than evidence." She let go, turning to a locked cabinet in the corner. When she opened it, the lantern light glinted off something. Metal guns, dozens of them. Mason's heart stuttered. Harper didn't blink. "We're going to need a war." The blood moon hung heavy over Black Hollow Cemetery exactly 1 year later, casting the same sickly glow across the same cracked gravestones where Claire had drawn her last breath. Mason stood in the shadows of the twisted oak, his fingers curled around the detonator in his pocket, his pulse a wild living thing in his throat. Every detail had been planned, the drones hidden in the trees, their cameras live streaming to every major news outlet. The cops Harper had quietly turned, their body wires humming with static. Even the fake tip sent to Leonard's men, luring them to the wrong side of town. But none of that stopped the cold sweat dripping down Mason's spine as headlights cut through the fog, the sleek black car rolling to a stop just feet from Claire's grave. Leonard stepped out, his tailored coat flaring behind him like a villain from some old movie. His face a mask of calm arrogance. He didn't look like a man walking into a trap. He looked like a king arriving to collect his due. Harper's voice crackled in Mason's earpiece, barely a whisper. "Wait for the signal." Couldn't. His eyes were locked on Leonard as the man knelt beside Claire's headstone, brushing away dead leaves with a gloved hand like he was paying respects instead of revisiting a crime scene. Then Leonard spoke, his voice carrying in the stillness. "I know you're here." Mason's breath froze. Had they been made? But Leonard wasn't looking at the trees. He was talking to the grave. "You really thought you could beat me, Claire? With some kid and a washed-up cop?" He laughed, low and ugly, pulling a flask from his coat. "I own this town. I own its secrets. And tonight?" He took a sip, smirking. "I'm going to own what's left of you, too." That was the moment Mason understood Leonard wasn't here because of the blackmail. He was here because he wanted to be, because killing Claire hadn't been enough. He needed to erase her completely. Harper's voice came again, sharp now. Mason hit the detonator. The explosion wasn't loud. It's just a controlled burst of light and smoke from the decoy car they'd rigged near the gates. Enough to send Leonard's bodyguard sprinting away from him. The distraction lasted 3 seconds. That was all Harper needed. She moved like a ghost, materializing behind Leonard with her gun pressed to his spine before he could turn. "Hello, Leonard," she said, her voice dripping with 20 years of vengeance. "Miss me?" What happened next unfolded in fragments burned into Mason's memory forever. Leonard's choked gasp as Harper forced him to his knees. "Wait." His perfect hair fell into his face as she wrenched his arms behind his back. The raw animal fear in his eyes when he realized the cameras were rolling, broadcasting his downfall to the world. But the moment that mattered most came when Harper leaned down, her lips brushing Leonard's ear as she whispered something only he could hear. Whatever she said turned him to stone. Then the police swarmed in, real police, the ones who weren't on Leonard's payroll, their sirens screaming through the night as they cuffed him, read him his rights, dragged him away kicking and screaming, about lawyers and lies. But it was too late. The footage was already viral. The ledger was in the hands of the FBI, and as Mason stepped out of the shadows, his face flickering across a million screens, he knew the truth couldn't be buried this time. He walked to Claire's grave, the weight of the past year sloughing off his shoulders like old skin, and placed a single white rose on the weathered stone. Somewhere behind him, Harper was giving a statement to the press, her voice steady for the first time in years. Somewhere beyond that, Leonard's empire was crumbling to dust. But here in this quiet corner of the cemetery, there was just Mason, and the whisper of the wind through the trees, sounding almost like laughter. Justice at last.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.